They weren't supposed to know. Not the Templars, not the monks, not the kings. But buried beneath centuries of dust and denial, a papyrus surfaced, cracked, charred, but legible enough to whisper something wild. That Horus had heirs. Not mythic, not metaphorical. Real. Flesh and blood. A lineage unbroken, hidden in sand and silence. And the Templars, those sworn defenders of faith, were tracing it. Not for power, not for relics, but to follow a bloodline that might still be walking among us. If that's true, then everything we thought was legend was legacy. Of course, stories like this don't shout. They murmur, drifting like incense in forgotten chapels. So breathe. Let your mind ease into the past. The noise of modern life fades here. What remains is stone parchment and questions that still twitch in candlelight. Picture a vault in a forgotten abbey nestled deep in the Alps. The floor creaks with the weight of centuries. No tourists here, just silence, cold air. And in the corner, under a broken tile, a satchel of documents left behind by a Templar scribe who never made it home. Among those crumbling pages lies something strange. Not a map, not a confession, a translation. One word in particular, Sahu, ancient Egyptian, not Latin, not Greek, a name used for Horus, or more precisely for Horus's embodiment on earth. A king, yes, but also a vessel, the one who carries on, who continues. For years, historians dismissed it as romantic nonsense, some long-dead knight with a flair for drama. But then the references started piling up in Jerusalem, in Cairo, in Montségur. The same phrases, same names, same obsessions. Not with gold or glory, but with blood. Specifically the blood of a child said to carry something divine. Something older than Christianity. Something older than Egypt. And the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. Because when the Templars crossed into the desert, they didn't just disappear. They found something. Or maybe someone. The echoes of that journey have never stopped haunting us. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. The archive was dull at first glance, tucked beneath a collapsed Crusader citadel in Acre, its stone bones half swallowed by the sea. Most of the parchment had rotted or burned, a casualty of siege and salt, but one scroll wrapped in brittle linen and lacquered with oil and ash remained curiously intact. It was unsigned, undated, and undecorated, only a string of Templar cipher marks along the edges, and a peculiar phrase near the top, ad sanguinem regis avis, toward the blood of the Bird King. It didn't sound like a standard order or a pilgrimage record. It read more like a riddle, or worse, a confession. At first, modern scholars dismissed the scroll as a fever dream from a Crusader cleric too long in the sun. But deeper examination revealed something harder to ignore: coordinates. Not perfect, but implied. Landmarks described in layers of metaphor: the split-toothed cliff, the black well that never dries, the temple whose shadow bends east at dawn. Cross-reference these phrases with medieval Arabic maps, and something emerges: a rough path leading into the Sinai interior, curving south, then east, veering off established pilgrim routes, and vanishing into the deep waste beyond the Red Sea coast. No trade cities, no garrisons, just desert. And then at the farthest point, one word: Heliopolis. The location matters, but not as much as the scroll's tone. It doesn't speak of conquest or glory. It speaks of pursuit, reverence even. The writer refers to the vessel sometimes as child, other times as lineage, always with trembling respect. It claims the blood was never severed, that from Osiris to Horus to the hidden carriers, the line ran unbroken through dynasties, through invasions, through deception. Not in palaces or temples, but in exile, in silence, in guardianship. One historical detail anchors this. In 1250, during the final years of the Seventh Crusade, the Templars stationed in Acre received a private dispatch from Cairo, an unusual event in itself. The sender was not a Christian, but a Fatimid scholar named Idris al-Bahari, a name mentioned in only one other surviving record, in connection with a banned sect that worshipped a version of Horus, not as a god, but as a prophetic bloodline. Idris's message was encoded, but the translation implies urgency. The child is gone, the temple broken. They took the star path north. The implication, the Templars were following something or someone after a sacred location had fallen. But the question is why? They weren't known for sympathizing with Egyptian theology, and they certainly weren't supposed to be corresponding with outlawed mystics in Cairo. Unless they believed the child wasn't mythic. Unless they believed the bloodline of Horus was not symbolic, but literal, tangible, alive. One controversial interpretation long ignored by mainstream historians links this scroll with the later appearance of an unusual Templar commandery in the hills of Antioch, where a fresco was painted showing a boy wrapped in linen seated beneath a falcon whose eyes were made of two red stones, garnets perhaps. But local legend claims they were tears of the desert. The same phrase appears again in the scroll. The tears of the desert guard the path of the air. Poetic, certainly, but possibly a code. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether the Templars believed in metaphysical reincarnation or actual genealogical transmission. Most documents suggest a symbolic use of sacred language, but this scroll, combined with its clear geographic detail and its reference to a child, leans toward something more literal. One strand of the debate posits that the Templars believed the Horus lineage had survived through priestly refuge, hidden away from the pharaoh's enemies, and later disguised among Christian sects during the Roman persecutions. That by the 13th century, the bloodline was fragile but intact, held by a single living descendant. This would explain the veiled language, the secrecy, the route that avoids cities and parishes alike. And it would also explain the near-obsessive focus on Heliopolis, which by the time of the Crusades had been reduced to ruins, haunted only by legend and sand. Yet here it is again, named in a scroll written in a French-Latin hybrid by a knight who should have had no knowledge of that city's forgotten sacred geography. And yet he knew the angle of its shadow, the bend of its river, the wind that howled through its broken obelisks. A detail from the scroll lingers like incense in a sealed chapel. He was not crowned but marked, not named but remembered, and he bore the eye where none could see. The phrasing seems half mystical, but what if it's literal, a birthmark, a scar, a symbol etched on skin and mistaken for accident? Throughout medieval Templar circles, the Eye of Horus is almost entirely absent from official seals, but it appears again and again in marginalia, hidden beneath red wax, scratched into walls, inked on the edges of personal Bibles. Not front and center, but always watching, which brings us to a final mystery. The scroll's last line was once unreadable, charred nearly to oblivion, but under infrared light a few more words were revealed. They form no clear sentence, just fragments, line unbroken, stone mouth, crimson path, and then finally, the phrase to be opened only when Rome sleeps. That line has puzzled everyone. Rome sleeps, a euphemism, a prophecy, or maybe a reference to the fall of papal vigilance. The Vatican archives are famously sealed on most Templar affairs, especially anything involving Egypt. And yet, one letter smuggled from the Vatican during the Napoleonic invasions makes a strange reference to fragments from the blood rites of the eye cult retrieved from Acre suppressed under papal seal. The scroll in the citadel may be one of those fragments. It may be nothing. Or it may be the beginning of the path the Templars followed, not to a treasure, not to a weapon, but to a boy. A boy whose blood was old, marked, sacred, and still moving even as kingdoms fell around him. The known maps ended at the Wadi el-Arish. Beyond that line, cartographers scribbled vague warnings, blank parchment filled with dragons, demons, or simply the word desert in trembling Latin. It wasn't just geography that grew uncertain, it was reality itself. But according to a set of fragmented Templar journey logs discovered in a collapsed outpost near Limassol, Cyprus, there was at least one caravan that didn't stop at the edge. It crossed over, quietly. No fanfare, no papal approval, no flags. Just a handful of knights, a translator, 2 Coptic scribes, and a guide paid in saffron and silence. Their destination was not Jerusalem, nor Cairo, nor any city with a name. Their destination was absence. The logs are sparse, less journal than inventory. Water rations, days of travel, sunrise angles. One entry simply reads, second moonrise behind Black Ridge Mark. Another, hunger at third, well, no stars above. But interspersed between the mundane are references to a structure never identified in any known medieval source. Column of Falcon's Gaze, stone that whispers beneath sand sanctuary of the mouthless god. These weren't metaphors, at least not to the men who wrote them. They were coordinates, markers. A language of movement carved into terrain passed between the initiated. The deeper the caravan pressed into Sinai, the more the records blur. Not due to poor writing, but intentional redaction. Lines scratched out with blades, entire pages torn free. A deliberate forgetting. One scholar, Dr. Elias Fontaine, proposed that these pages weren't lost to time, they were removed by design. His theory, dismissed as sensationalist, argues that the Templars encountered something so anomalous in the deep desert that it had to be erased not just from the world, but from memory. Not because it was heretical, because it was undeniable. There is one intact passage left in the surviving log, scribbled in the margins with dry ink. He walked ahead of us, the child, skin of bronze, eyes like storm. He knew the path before we spoke it. He said we were late. It would be easy to chalk this up to heat stroke, exhaustion, hallucination. But the next day's entry records a detour sharp east toward a ravine called Al-Kahir, the one who subdues. A name that appears in no Latin documents and only sparingly in Bedouin oral lore. The detour was never explained. But the next entry, chapel stones not ours. Falcon sign etched into keystone. That's when the record ends. Not with a return, with silence. We know the caravan never made it back to Acre. That much is confirmed by the order's own ledgers. Supplies went out, men departed, but no one returned. Not even the guide. The trail vanishes. All that remains are rumors passed among desert tribes, stories of pale warriors who drank from the wrong spring, who asked about the eye in the sky and vanished beneath the dunes. One consistent feature in those tribal stories is a figure called Al-Walad al-Mabsut, the unbound child. He appears differently depending on the teller. Sometimes he's a boy dressed in linen with eyes like lapis. Sometimes he's a girl with a scar shaped like a falcon's wing. Always young, always quiet, and always somehow waiting, not hiding, waiting. The implication being that the bloodline of Horus wasn't lost. It simply wandered into places that maps refused to follow. A compelling historical footnote anchors this further. In 1271, just 1 year after this Templar caravan vanished, Sultan Baybars issued a sealed decree forbidding excavation or travel near a region known to locals as the mouth of the sands. No explanation was given. The area wasn't strategic. It had no known settlements or tombs, yet the penalty for trespass was death by burial. One Western merchant caught straying too close was reportedly sealed beneath the eye, whatever that meant. This decree has no counterpart in any other regional edict and was quietly rescinded 30 years later. But it lines up unnervingly well with the final coordinates from the Templar logs. Modern archaeologists searching for ruins in that stretch of Sinai have reported strange compass interference, magnetic anomalies, and equipment malfunctions. Most dismiss it as a quirk of local geology. One expedition in 1992 claimed to have found foundation stones older than Old Kingdom work and carved with an unfamiliar bird glyph. They went silent soon after. Funding pulled. Site abandoned. Even now, no official dig has been permitted in that zone. An open question among esoteric historians remains if the Templars were indeed tracing a living bloodline through the desert. How did they know where to go? And why did they go without sanction? The order was highly structured, beholden to Rome and its own Grand Master. Any unsanctioned journey risked excommunication. And yet these men not only went rogue, they vanished doing so, which suggests they believed what they were chasing was worth more than allegiance, than safety, even salvation. A callback emerges from the scroll found in Acre. The line about the tears of the desert guarding the air takes on new resonance when compared with these redacted logs. Perhaps it wasn't metaphor. Perhaps they were led to something sacred or something forbidden. And once they found it, they were no longer allowed to return. A contemporary of these knights, William of Tyre, wrote of desert silences that swallow even the righteous. His phrase wasn't about death, it was about disappearance. The kind of disappearance that rewrites belief, that turns soldiers into pilgrims. That suggests the eye didn't close with Egypt's fall, but opened wider in exile. The route beyond the known maps may never yield a destination on GPS, but its ghost still haunts Templar records, not for what they found, but for the silence they left behind. The figure of Horus is burned into popular imagination as a god of vengeance, a falcon-headed warrior standing atop the ruins of his father's enemies. Most remember him that way, a mythical hero born of Isis after the death of Osiris, destined to avenge his father's murder by defeating the chaos-bringer Set. It's an old tale, grand, bloody, divine. But buried beneath the epic imagery lies something quieter, stranger. Not a god, but a boy. Not vengeance, but inheritance. And that reinterpretation may be the very key the Templars believed they had uncovered. In the Temple of Edfu, long before the Templars marched through the Levant, Egyptian priests carved a series of reliefs depicting Horus not in his adult warrior form, but as a child, Harpocrates, seated with a finger to his lips. This image has often been taken to symbolize silence or secrecy, especially in later Greco-Roman interpretations. But one obscure school of Egyptologists, led by the controversial but persistent Dr. Elodie Mansour, has suggested a different reading. They argue the finger-to-mouth pose is not a gesture of silence, but nourishment, a child nursing a lineage beginning, not ending. This changes everything. If Horus was originally a child of survival, not a god of revenge, then his myth becomes something more human and perhaps more traceable. Instead of ending in divine apotheosis, his story becomes genealogical. Legacy, not legend. Here's where things get tangled. In several pre-dynastic carvings predating even the First Dynasty, there are depictions of a figure scholars call the Falcon Prince, often shown leading a procession of what appear to be priests, warriors, and midwives. That detail tends to go unnoticed in tour guides, but it suggests a focus not on death rites, but birth, continuity. In one such carving, now mostly lost due to erosion, the figure carries a crook and flail, not symbols of kingship, but symbols of shepherding and care. The figure's head bears a circlet shaped like a star, not a crown, a constellation. Modern archaeology has only recently begun re-examining these fragments, but the idea they suggest is compelling, that Horus was not a singular god in the pantheon, but a prototype, a title perhaps. A hereditary role passed down through a chosen line. In this view, Horus was not one being, but many. A bloodline reinforced by ritual, protected by priesthood, and concealed when the world changed. Just like royal lines of Europe claimed descent from Arthur or Charlemagne, so too might Egyptian heirs have traced themselves to the first Horus. That raises a very controversial question. If Horus was a dynastic title, was there a final bearer? And did someone centuries later try to find him? The Templar scrolls from Acre hinted at this possibility, but more provocatively so did a Coptic commentary on the Book of Enoch, discovered in a monastery near Luxor. This manuscript, mostly ignored due to its non-canonical status, describes a light-bearing child, the last falcon hidden while kingdoms fall. The phrasing is poetic, yes, but it echoes that same description found in the Templar scribe's record of a boy who walked ahead of the caravan and knew the path before we spoke it. Both texts reference a boy who is not taught, but remembered. Not instructed, but returning. A factual note worth anchoring here: Egyptian tradition recognized a title known as Se Netjer. The Son of God applied not only to pharaohs, but to their heirs. The title was not merely honorary, it denoted divine function expected to be fulfilled in ritual. These rituals included the Hebsed, a renewal of divine vigor staged every 30 years. Most scholars interpret this as political theater. But what if it was more? What if the rituals weren't to reaffirm rule, but to test whether the divine presence remained in the air? This is where the Templars, those practical warriors turned mystics, might have found an unlikely mirror. Their own initiation rites, as later rumored under torture, included acts of symbolic rebirth, the rejection of false crowns, and an oath of service not to Rome, but to He who comes bearing the sign. That line appears repeatedly in inquisitorial transcripts, often dismissed as metaphor. But it has an eerie resonance when placed alongside Horus mythology, where the returning heir bears the sign of the eye, a mark of recognition, a blood token, maybe even a literal scar. The scholarly debate continues to this day. Was Horus meant to be a metaphor for solar cycles, divine justice, the eternal return of kingship? Or was he, as certain desert tribes and buried texts suggest, an actual dynastic figure whose lineage passed through generations under different names, hidden from empires, revealed only in times of collapse? A callback comes quietly here from that vanished Templar caravan, whose journal noted, "He was not crowned, but marked." It's easy to imagine that line as allegory. But paired with what the Luxor manuscript calls the line that moves through shadow, it begins to sound like something else. A trail, a thread, a search. The historian Dr. Basil Carter once quipped, "The most dangerous idea in history is that a god could breed." Perhaps that was the secret the Templars chased, not that Horus was divine, but that he was real, mortal, tracked across generations, and not finished. Heliopolis was already a ruin by the time the Crusaders turned their eyes eastward. Once the shining solar capital of ancient Egypt, home to the obelisks that now mark Rome and Paris, it had long since faded into a hushed landscape of toppled stones and half-remembered names. But for the Templars, It wasn't the light of Ra they sought in those ruins. It was what lay beneath them. Or rather, what someone had hidden there long before the Caesars walked the earth. The first whisper comes from a Coptic monk named Theodosius, who penned an anonymous gospel fragment in the 9th century. Preserved only in partial form and found in the monastery of St. Anthony, the scroll tells of a child prince of the god bird buried not among kings, but beneath the watchers of the sun. Most dismissed the writing as symbolic Christian apocrypha, but the Templars seemed to think otherwise. One of the few remaining records of their journey, a now infamous itinerary attributed to Brother Anselm of Limoges, details a planned detour to On, the old name for Heliopolis. According to his notes, their interest wasn't in the above-ground temples, which were little more than scavenged blocks by then, but in a specific underground vault. The notes refer to it cryptically as the chamber where the winged birth was sealed. Modern archaeologists will tell you that much of ancient Heliopolis lies underneath modern Cairo, and they're right. But in 1902, during French excavations near Mataria, workers unearthed a basalt slab carved with the Eye of Horus, surrounded by concentric circles. Not unusual in itself unless you consider the depth. The slab was pulled from nearly 20 meters below the surface beneath what had once been a well. The dig was halted after a laborer disappeared. Officially, it was a collapse. Unofficially, rumors swirled of a descending passage they were ordered to seal. Here's where the historical thread becomes stranger. An old Fatimid-era map housed in Istanbul's Topkapi Library shows Heliopolis with a red X marked under an inverted falcon, unusual not just for its position, but for the caption nesting place of the god seed. This phrase appears nowhere else in Islamic cartography. It's almost absurd in its imagery. Almost. Unless you've read the Templar record found in Acre, the one that ends with a reference to a stone mouth and crimson path. Both phrases appear again in Anselm's itinerary. The real clincher came with a 1926 report written by an Egyptian antiquities inspector named Selim Farouk. His team discovered a narrow chamber carved with inscriptions that defied translation. Hieroglyphs were interspersed with unknown sigils, some resembling Proto-Hebrew, others like stylized birds or stars. At its center, a child-sized stone coffin, cracked and empty. No relics, no bones, just a small gold ring etched with a motif scholars could not place at the time, a falcon clutching a scroll. The artifact was transferred to a museum, then it vanished. No catalog, no record. Only a photograph remains tucked inside Farouk's personal journal. This brings us to the open question: if this tomb beneath Heliopolis was indeed created to house a child, why was it hidden so deeply, far beneath the ceremonial temples above? The Egyptians were masters of burial architecture. Secret tombs weren't uncommon, but this one appears constructed not merely to protect remains, but to erase them. There's no cartouche naming the deceased, no funerary texts, just symbols, silence, and the sense of something deliberately buried beneath the known world. Historians have since argued that the sarcophagus might have belonged to a lesser royal, perhaps a child of a high priest. But the few remaining glyphs defy easy explanation. One in particular shows a falcon emerging from a human heart, wings unfurled across a crescent moon. This isn't standard Egyptian iconography, but it matches almost exactly a wall carving in the Templar commandery at Monsonès, the same chapel later sealed by papal order and repurposed as a barn. That callback matters, because while most of the world was busy arguing over relics of the Passion, the Templars were building shrines that mirrored ancient motifs from a continent away. And the more their movements are tracked, the more their trail begins to resemble a puzzle. Not a random scattering of temples and strongholds, but a pattern, a constellation. perhaps even a map. One curious feature of the supposed tomb was the ceiling lined with dark stone polished smooth, covered in carvings of stars. Not Egyptian stars, though. Astronomers who've seen Farouk's photos argue the patterns resemble constellations, not visible from Egypt at the time of the tomb's construction, but from the southern hemisphere. The implications of this, if the chamber is truly that ancient, are vast. Some say the carvings could be symbolic. Others suggest they were inherited knowledge passed down from desert tribes with oral traditions far older than the Nile's dynasties. And then there's the scent. The journal mentions it twice. A faint, sweet, almost metallic odor lingering near the stone coffin. Not rot, not incense, something else, something unplaceable. Scientists today might attribute it to residual minerals, but Farouk's team included a chemist who took scrapings and labeled the aroma unknown compound organic base. Could this have been a burial chamber? Possibly. But the lack of remains, human or otherwise, suggests a different purpose. Perhaps a sanctuary. Perhaps a decoy. Or perhaps, as one line in the Templar scroll phrases it, the shell left when the wing is taken. So here's the uncomfortable thought. What if this tomb was never meant to protect the dead? What if it was built to shelter the living, at least for a time? A child hidden away beneath the sun, God's city, protected not by stone walls, but by forgetfulness. Disappeared so thoroughly that even the myths moved on, forgetting that the eye once blinked and then closed. Long after the last dynasties fell and the temples crumbled into quiet sand, something refused to die. Egypt, for all its monuments and mummies, was not just a place of stones, it was a place of memory. And memory, as it turns out, is harder to bury. Beneath the rise of Christianity, beneath the weight of Rome, beneath even the expansion of Islam, a few strange currents continued to flow, whispers of an old priesthood that had gone underground. Not metaphorically, literally. They called themselves the Keepers of the Breath, or at least that's how one 11th century Arabic chronicle translated it. The name in the original text is nearly unpronounceable, composed of root words that mean both air and air. The manuscript comes from a lesser-known library in Fustat, Cairo's predecessor, and details the final rites of a banned sect that worshipped Horus not as a god of vengeance, but as a living inheritance, an embodied presence, a lineage. This alone might seem like esoteric nonsense, one of the many fringe cults that thrived on the edges of empire. But the chronicle includes something more: locations. Names of settlements, caves, hidden libraries. Most are long erased, but one remains: the valley of Al-Sara al-Safra, or the Pale Desert. Modern maps place it just east of Beni Suef, near the boundary between habitable Nile lands and the drifting horizon. And in 1872, a British surveyor named Henry Dalton recorded an abandoned structure there. A square temple, mostly buried, no roof. Inside, he described 4 pillars carved with falcons, their eyes worn smooth by wind. Dalton's notes include a sketch of a circular symbol carved into the center of the temple floor, a falcon in flight surrounded by 13 stars. He had no idea what it meant. He assumed it was a late Islamic motif, perhaps even a family crest. But beside the drawing, he wrote a single line: "Air tasted strange, very cold. No birds overhead." The fact that this symbol reappears almost identically in a Templar codex discovered at Dôme is more than coincidence. The Dôme manuscript, written during the order's imprisonment in France, is encoded in pictograms and riddles. But a careful translation reveals something peculiar. A passage describing the brethren of the blind falcon who kept the blood warm even when the temple froze. It's a baffling line until you remember Dalton's drawing and the chronicle from Fustat and the legends of the heir who waits. That phrase, the heir who waits, is not unique to Egypt. It appears startlingly in Ethiopian oral tradition, where it's rendered as Yared Beit Shem, or House of the Sleeping Light. These are not casual overlaps. They suggest a chain of preservation, a handoff of ideas or of people across regions and centuries. And at the center of it all, the consistent image, a child bearing the eye. The historical fact underpinning this connection is a curious one. During the early Islamic period, several Egyptian priests who resisted conversion were not executed, but disappeared. Records of them end suddenly without death or exile noted. A few names appear in unexpected places in Syriac scrolls and Nubian church ledgers, in the margins of Armenian gospel translations. This scattering suggests something intentional, a diaspora not of fear, but of preservation. One group split into many carrying pieces of something too dangerous to centralize. A lineage, perhaps, or the memory of one. There's also an obscure reference in the writings of al-Makrizi, a 15th century Egyptian historian, who wrote of a sect of silence that met near the ruins of Yunu Heliopolis. He claims they held no idols, spoke no prayers aloud, and waited only for the breath to return to the blood. That phrasing, breath and blood, returns again and again in these scattered references, always in tandem, always in reverent tones, and it dovetails unnervingly well with the Templar record we examined earlier, where a falcon rises from a human heart. The implication, life renewed. Not resurrection, but continuation. There is still debate among scholars whether these secretive groups were remnants of ancient priesthoods or simply romantic fictions layered onto religious resistance. But the evidence points to something more persistent than mere myth. Archaeological teams in the early 20th century excavated a series of underground chambers near Minya filled not with mummies or treasure, but with scrolls none in classical Egyptian. Instead, the texts were written in a cryptic hybrid language that blended Coptic Greek and symbols unfamiliar to any known script. Most were prayers, but a few were genealogies, not of pharaohs, of unnamed figures, each entry ending with the same symbol, a closed eye with 3 tears beneath it. The open question remains, what were they hiding? A belief, a prophecy, or someone? A soft callback emerges now like a shadow behind torchlight, that strange Templar line to be opened only when Rome sleeps. Perhaps the bloodline wasn't just protected. Perhaps it was concealed so thoroughly that only a network of believers scattered like dust could one day reassemble it. The last known mention of the cult comes from a 14th century Vatican intelligence report penned by a Jesuit assigned to monitor Eastern heresies. He describes a village where the children are taken into the sand once a year to lie beneath the moon, and the elders listen for the breath of the god-bird. He considered the practice delusional. But what caught his attention was a drawing carved into the stone above a nearby spring, an unmistakable eye tilted sideways, its pupil an empty circle. Beneath it, written in ancient Greek, he sleeps until the falcons cry. Perhaps that cry echoed louder than anyone expected. Loud enough for knights in white mantles to hear it even from across the sea. The desert hides many things, bones, temples, time itself. But perhaps the most potent things it conceals are words, names. Names written, erased, rewritten again in secrecy. Names that carried too much weight to be spoken aloud. In the shadowy back rooms of Egypt's monastic libraries behind candle-blackened walls and stacks of hymnals, no one reads a different kind of scripture once waited. Not canon, not heresy even, just dangerous. Because it didn't speak of saints or martyrs. It spoke of a child. The manuscript was discovered in 1964 by a French Jesuit scholar named Lucien Ferrat while cataloging neglected Coptic scrolls at the White Monastery in Sohag. It was bound in rough papyrus barely held together by sinew thread, its ink faded almost to dust. Ferrat initially assumed it was another apocryphal gospel, but when he began translating, he realized he was reading something older, stranger. It wasn't a gospel at all. It was a coded chronicle, a record of a birth. The name was never written plainly. Every mention of the child bore a substitute glyph, a combination of the Coptic omega and a stylized bird. Ferrat translated the title as the light bearer beneath the dust. The narrative spoke of a time after temples had been overturned, when a priestess carried the breath of the bird god into exile. She was not named either. She was referred to only as the last voice of the eye. The child she carried was described not as divine, but as the seal of the old breath. Flesh and blood, yes, but different. Modern scholars struggle with the phrasing. Some interpret it as a Gnostic metaphor. Others argue it's a veiled reference to a messianic figure. But one particular passage gives pause. They marked his skin not with ink but light. His cry made falcons tremble. The mountain bent before him, and the silence remembered his name. Too poetic to be historical, possibly. But then you remember the ring found in the Heliopolis tomb, the star pattern beneath its lid. The Templar record referring to a child who knew the path before we spoke it. Echoes. Too many to ignore. One historical fact grounds this narrative in the 6th century during the Byzantine suppression of Egyptian monastic orders. Several monastic codices were hidden in clay jars and buried beneath floorstones. Many were discovered in Nag Hammadi, but others like Ferrat's codex surfaced later in obscure locations. This particular scroll had been reshelved under a mislabeled heading, Minor Psalms, as if someone had tried to bury it within bureaucracy. What makes this manuscript so dangerous isn't just what it claims. It's the names it nearly reveals. Ferrat was able to decode fragments of a genealogy. Not a royal line, but a protected one, guardians, stewards, watchers. Names like Aset of Nubra, Theo the Blue Monk, and Menneus the Twice-Born, each marked with the same glyph, the bird-eye seal. None of them appear in ecclesiastical records. But an obscure fragment from a Templar document found in Béziers, written in code, lists 3 nearly identical names as keepers of the child's voice. That correlation was dismissed by most as coincidence. After all, the Templars shouldn't have had access to Coptic texts. And yet, in a side chapel at the ruined commandery in Lyon, France, a mural long painted over was uncovered during restoration in 1999. Beneath layers of limewash, conservators revealed a central image, a child surrounded by 6 robed figures. 5 hold scrolls. The 6th holds nothing but raises a hand in blessing. Above them, a falcon, wings outstretched. And beneath the fresco, barely etched into the stone, a phrase in Coptic Greek, the name lives in silence. That brings us to a controversial detail. In the Vatican's suppressed register of condemned books, a reference appears to Codex Lamed, banned in 1443 for containing Egyptian phantasms and heretical bloodline schema. The index claims the text was destroyed, but Ferrat believed his scroll was a fragment of it, either an excerpt or a mirror copy. When he presented this theory at a minor academic conference in Vienna, the reaction was tepid. Polite disinterest followed by quiet pressure. Ferrat's funding disappeared within months. He died in 1971, reportedly of pneumonia. The scroll vanished. Only his partial translations survive, published posthumously in a university journal no one reads. The debate continues: was this codex a literary invention, a Gnostic allegory, or a record of something far older and far more grounded, an actual bloodline passed not in crowns, but in shadows, a quiet line passed down by those sworn not to rule, but to hide? A callback lingers like a riddle, the heir who waits from the previous chapter. Perhaps the scroll wasn't meant to reveal his name. Perhaps it was meant to erase it, protect it. After all, what is more dangerous than a forgotten god returning with proof of birth? We're left with an open question hanging between lost parchment and ruined fresco. Why would so many different cultures, Templar Coptic desert tribes, repeat the same motif: a child marked, a lineage in exile, a name whispered, then silenced? What kind of truth requires that many veils? And if the Templars risked everything to uncover it, what did they see? They were warriors, first monks, second. At least that's how most remember the Templars, sword-bearing zealots in white mantles marked by a red cross. Discipline, silence, obedience. But beneath the martial rigor and vows of poverty lay something stranger, something older. It surfaced not in battles or decrees, but in their rites, initiation rituals, architectural blueprints, carved details in places no soldier had reason to decorate. And one image kept returning the eye. Not just any eye. Not the omniscient eye of later Masonic lore. This one was always left-facing, surrounded by rays, and often perched within or above a bird, usually a falcon. It appeared in marginalia hidden on the underside of stone benches, scratched faintly into candle holders, and the floor tiles of side chapels. Always subtle, always hidden, never explained. One 14th century inquisitorial transcript from the trial of Brother Jean du Velay included a curious line. Under duress, he confessed that during his initiation, I was shown the eye that sees in darkness, and was told I must bear it not upon my chest, but behind my breath. Most scholars waved this away as metaphor or the product of torture-induced rambling. But the phrasing closely echoes a passage from a Coptic hymn discovered in the Theban necropolis: the breath hides the eye. To speak it is to betray it. That line predates the Templars by centuries, and yet here it was whispered in a European dungeon. One documented historical fact grounds this discussion. The Templar commandery in Tamar, Portugal, built in the late 12th century, contains an octagonal chapel with a central column adorned with falcon wing motifs. Not crosses, not lambs, falcons, woven into the stone in such a way that they only become visible in late afternoon light. More curious still, the column is ringed by carved eyes, each with a single tear. Local legend refers to it as the column that watches. No formal records explain its symbolism. But medieval pilgrims claimed standing beside it gave them visions, headaches at least. A controversial interpretation arose in the 19th century, championed by an eccentric Anglican scholar named Maxwell Ardross. He believed the Templar order secretly adopted Egyptian ritual motifs passed through Coptic Christian channels as a way of preserving what he called the blood myth of the eye. His argument, long dismissed, centered on a series of parchment fragments found in the Temple Church in London. These documents, later lost in the Blitz, supposedly described a rite wherein initiates would be blindfolded, led through a labyrinth of columns, and brought before a tapestry, showing a child with a bird's head and a star in his palm. The initiate was told to see with breath, not eyes. Ardross believed this was a corrupted version of a Horus ritual from the Ptolemaic period, in which priests communed with the Sahu, or spirit body of the god, through dream work and focused breathing. Now, whether or not the Templars really used Egyptian ritual is up for debate, but the overlapping imagery is hard to ignore. In one documented Templar seal found near Metz, a falcon perches atop a cross. Its wings are not outstretched in flight, but curved around the top of the cross as though shielding it. A protective gesture. Beneath the falcon is a word most miss oculus Latin for eye. Not the all-seeing eye of God, but the specific organ singular intimate embodied. We've already seen in earlier scrolls the description of a child marked not with ink but with light, a symbol born on the skin. If that's true, the eye was not only a sign, it was a signal, a means of recognition, a way to identify the heir. Which brings us to an overlooked point. The Templars, for all their structured hierarchy, had a strange relationship to secrecy. Their highest rites were never written down. Initiates were bound to silence under threat of death. In some commanderies, even the names of the officers were kept hidden from lower ranks. That kind of compartmentalization isn't just organizational, it's protective, as though they were guarding not merely a treasure, but a person. A curious callback appears here. In the scroll from the citadel of Acre, the writer says the child bore the eye where none could see. At the time, it seemed poetic. But if the eye was a symbol passed down through ritual embedded into the consciousness of a select few, it makes sense that it would be woven into their ceremonies, encoded in movement, breath, gesture. Not to inform, to recognize. Another open debate among scholars concerns the influence of Gnostic traditions on early Templar theology. While the Church condemned Gnosticism, certain elements crept into Crusader lands, especially in the East, where Coptic, Syriac, and Byzantine mysticism left their fingerprints. The concept of hidden knowledge of the divine spark within flesh aligns unsettlingly well with the idea of a sacred bloodline encoded in a child. A child who was not a symbol, but a carrier. There are no direct Templar texts that state flatly, "We believe Horus had heirs." Of course not. But their use of the eye, their silence around its meaning, and the architectural anomalies in their places of worship all point toward something unspoken, something powerful enough to organize entire rituals around. So we're left with a question. Did the Templars discover something in Egypt that rewired their very purpose? Were they still crusading for Christendom? Or had they shifted toward preserving something older, stranger, and far more heretical? Perhaps the answer lies not in what they built, but in what they buried. After all, it's said that during the last years of the Order, a handful of knights vanished from record entirely, not killed, not imprisoned, just gone. No graves, no trials. Just a whisper that they were watching the eye from the other side of breath, whatever that means. Southern France is not where you'd expect to find Egyptian mythology hiding in stone. Lavender fields, Roman ruins, Cathar ghosts, yes. But falcons and eyes of Horus, that's a different kind of story. Yet nestled quietly in the foothills of the Pyrenees stands the chapel of Mont-Cenis, a former Templar commandery that should be like any other modest, weather-worn, and boring. Instead, it whispers. Not loudly, not to everyone. Just to those who know where to look. And once you hear it, it's hard to unhear. The chapel's ceiling, miraculously intact, is covered in painted symbols, stars, geometric patterns, and a very strange falcon-headed figure holding what looks like a scepter shaped like a key. His wings are partially open. Around him swirl a dozen red stars arranged in a spiral. At first glance, it's decorative, but closer inspection reveals something odd. The stars aren't random. Their placement mirrors the precession of certain constellations visible from Egypt around 2000 BCE. Someone knew the sky very well. For years, locals chalked it up to artistic license, but the 1976 restoration revealed more beneath the painted plaster, were engraved motifs that hadn't been visible for centuries. One of them was unmistakable, the left-facing eye etched in with obsessive precision. Another was a symbol almost identical to the bird-eye glyph found in the Coptic Codex from Sohag, previously thought to be unique to Egypt. The same lines, the same curve of the wing enclosing a circle. No Latin letters, no cross, just that image floating above the altar. Here's the historical fact: Monsonès was founded by the Templars around 1145. Its location was strategic, close to Cathar territory, near trade routes, and far from major scrutiny. And according to tax records and local lore, it received several undocumented shipments from the Levant in the late 1200s. No cargo manifests survive. Just a receipt for sealed crates from Tripoli by hand of Brother Mathieu. Mathieu appears nowhere else in Templar records. But a Templar scribe by that name was recorded as part of the Sinai expedition, outlined in earlier scrolls. There's more. In 1981, an amateur historian named Claire Aubin was granted permission to study the chapel's iconography. What she found in the cloister carvings shocked her. Among typical Christian scenes was a figure kneeling before a child whose head is ringed not by a halo, but by a golden bird. The kneeling figure is not robed. He wears armor, and his chest bears the unmistakable red cross of the Templars. Beneath the carving is a single word in archaic Occitan Savajat, translation watched over. The carving had been whitewashed and forgotten, but it wasn't defaced. It was preserved, hidden. A callback from earlier scrolls echoes here. The description of a child who walked ahead and bore the eye where none could see. What if this image in the chapel wasn't metaphor? What if the Templars who returned from Egypt brought with them not just relics, but memory, and perhaps more than memory? Perhaps a story, or a secret they were bound to honor. A controversial interpretation by iconographer Jérôme Lavigne suggests that the ceiling fresco's 12 red stars do not represent constellations at all, but bloodlines. He argues that the falcon-headed figure at Monsonès is not the god Horus, but a symbolic protector of a sacred lineage, each star representing a steward, not an ancestor. His paper was laughed out of academic journals, but then again, so were early claims that Templar chapels contained encoded astronomical alignments, which were later proven. Here's the open question: if Monsonès was a waypoint in a longer journey, part of a trail of silence and symbols stretching from Sinai to southern France, what exactly were the Templars guarding here? No bones have been found, no vaults uncovered, but geomantic analysis in 2012 revealed a hollow beneath the apse roughly 4 meters wide, sealed with lead and stone. Requests to excavate have been denied. Preservation concerns, naturally. And yet in the chapel's rear vestry, there remains an object no one quite knows how to explain. A fragment of polished obsidian shaped like a teardrop embedded in the wall. At a certain hour of morning light, the eye painted on the ceiling aligns perfectly with the reflection from that obsidian shard, casting a beam of red across the floor, pointing directly at the altar. It happens only on 2 days each year, the spring and autumn equinoxes. Accident, artistic flair. Or was this an ancient signal, an alignment encoded not for worship, but for memory? It all feels too deliberate, too specific, and too secret. One final piece adds weight to this thread. A letter found in the Vatican's restricted collection, dated 1310, addressed to Pope Clement V, describes a heretical chapel in the south, where pagan signs adorn Christian walls, and where certain brothers claim to await the return of a light-bearing heir. The location is not named. But the letter ends with a request: dispatch inquisitors to Mons. The parchment is torn, the name incomplete. But there aren't many Templar sites in southern France beginning with Mons. So we're left staring at a fresco wondering whether it was painted to tell a story or to preserve one. Whether the falcon wasn't just symbolic of protection, but of witness. A quiet guardian watching over a bloodline that was never meant to die, only to wait. In the dusty heart of Upper Egypt, where tourists rarely tread and the Nile flows past broken columns and date palms, lies the forgotten city of Akhmim. It was once known as Chemis, the ancient cult center of the mother goddess Mut, and later as a monastic stronghold in the Coptic era. But sometime in between empire and scripture, between pharaoh and saint, it became something else. A vault, a place of storage, or burial, or both. The story begins, as so many strange ones do, with a French expedition in 1851. Funded quietly by the Institut d'Egypte and officially tasked with surveying Coptic ruins, the team was led by a prickly and deeply curious man named Etienne Moreau. His journals, kept private until long after his death, tell of a local guide who brought him to a site where the ground breathed strange. That's how he described it. Not cursed, not sacred, just strange. They found the entrance buried beneath debris from a collapsed Christian shrine. What they uncovered beneath was not a tomb, not a temple, and not a crypt. It was a chamber dry as bone, its walls lined with niches. Each niche held a clay vessel sealed with wax. Inside scrolls, some in Coptic, some in Greek, but a few in an unfamiliar script, cursive angular almost resembling Syriac, but reversed. Moreau didn't understand them, but he recognized something chillingly familiar. Each scroll was marked with a symbol, an open eye with a single downward line beneath it. Not a tear, a path. One scroll stood apart. It was wrapped in linen dyed with indigo and marked with what looked like a falcon in flight. It bore no writing at first glance, but when unwrapped under lamplight, characters shimmered across its surface in faint red pigment. Moreau called it the Red Testament. In his notes, he records a partial translation: born in the light of both suns, he shall pass unseen the seed of the watcher. Now, historians have long argued about what that line could mean. The two suns could reference political duality, pharaoh and priest perhaps, or symbolic parentage. But one interpretation quietly circulated among esoteric scholars links it to ancient astronomical alignments, specifically the rare celestial event when Sirius and the sun rise together, known to the Egyptians as the birth of the year. A sign of renewal, of divine presence. If a child were born under that sign, he would have been regarded not as ordinary, but sacred. Among the other scrolls in the chamber was something even more startling: a set of genealogical charts. Not royal trees, but something humbler. Dozens of names, many scratched out, some encircled. Each chart began with a symbol, never a name. A circle surrounded by wings. One chart bears the word Net Jerusa, a compound rarely used which loosely translates to divine body lineage. That phrasing appears nowhere in standard Egyptian theology, but it is uncannily close to the term Sahu, the spiritual essence of a person after death, associated with divine inheritance. Here, though, it is paired with living names, breathing names. This is the historical fact Akhmim was known for preserving banned texts. During the Arab conquest, several Christian sects fled to its caves. During the Byzantine persecutions, even more came. What was stored in this chamber may have passed through many hands: Coptic scribes, mystic monks, or remnants of an older priesthood. What makes it even more fascinating is that the falcon eye symbol etched into one of the scroll cases is identical down to the brushstroke to a carving on a stone pillar at Monsonès, the same commandery described earlier. A callback becomes unavoidable. That image in the French chapel, the kneeling Templar before the child with the bird's crown, suddenly feels less allegorical. If these scrolls were ever seen by the Templars, even partially, they would have understood what they implied. Not myth, blood, not metaphor, succession. A secret lineage surviving beneath layers of faith buried in clay jars waiting. Moreau's notes end abruptly. The chamber was resealed. A handful of scrolls were taken, then lost, some say, stolen, others say hidden. But one made its way to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, filed quietly as Fragment du Testament Rouge. It's badly damaged. Only 2 lines remain legible: guard the breath, not the name. Let the eye speak when the stars return. A curious footnote complicates things further. In 1909, a German archaeologist named Klaus Ehrenfeld claimed to have found a second chamber beneath the same site. He said it contained a basalt altar with an inscription, "To the seed of Horus, when silence ends." His report was never published. He died 2 months later. His field notes vanished, but a single photograph survives, showing a man standing in a dark room, his hand resting on a block carved with the falcon eye symbol. The photo has never been authenticated, but the shadow of that symbol has flown far and wide. And so we ask, what were these genealogies for? Who compiled them? Were they evidence, prophecy, or simple remembrance? The open question lingers. If the lineage of Horus survived, scattered, hidden, carried by protectors across centuries, then Akhmim was not a tomb. It was a ledger. A record not of rulers, but of vessels. Names passed down in whispers, protected not by gold or swords, but by those willing to be forgotten. Perhaps that's why the Templars came looking, not for a relic to display, but for a name to remember. If there is a trail to be followed, if this mystery truly unfolds across continents and centuries, it doesn't run straight. It weaves, like old thread pulled through unfamiliar cloth, and somewhere in that weave, it twists from the golden dust of Egypt to the misty cliffs of southern France, from the dying embers of Memphis to the smoldering end of Montségur. What ties these two places together is not geography, but silence. A silence shaped by secrecy and by something worth dying for. Memphis, once a capital of Egypt's old kingdom, had by the 13th century become a faded shadow. A few Coptic monasteries clung to its outskirts, preserving fragments of pagan architecture in Christian disguise. Most of the world forgot it, but not everyone. A peculiar record hidden within the archives of the Vatican and later leaked by a Jesuit defector in the 17th century describes a pilgrimage of the white-cloaked men to the mouth of the sleeper. The location matches the ancient necropolis of Saqqara. The timing aligns with a known Templar detachment stationed in Cairo under the pretense of protecting pilgrims. The document is sparse on details, but its phrasing is suggestive. They took nothing. They left no dead. But the watchman said the earth wept where they passed. Not long after, a new route begins to appear in obscure travelogues stretching from Egypt through the Levant, winding along trade routes and monastic outposts, curving up through Italy and eventually landing in the Languedoc region of France. This wasn't a trade path. It wasn't marked by caravans or tax records. It was barely there. But wherever it passed, remnants of Falcon iconography emerged in odd places: monastery walls, marginalia in psalters scratched on the undersides of pews. And then Montségur, the last stronghold of the Cathars, a heretical Christian sect that believed the material world was the creation of a false god. Rome called them blasphemers, but to those who stood atop that wind-swept fortress in 1244, the flames that would consume them were a kind of baptism. They burned for refusing to confess, but perhaps they burned for what they protected. The final siege of Montségur is well documented, but one detail remains anomalous. Just before the fortress fell, a small group of defenders allegedly escaped down the sheer cliffs carrying a mysterious object. Local legend calls it le trésor des Cathars, the Cathar treasure. No gold was ever found, no relics unearthed, just an absence that echoed louder than any artifact. A letter written by a Dominican inquisitor stationed near Toulouse in 1246 claims that survivors of Montségur spoke of the child of the eye passed into safety by men not of our faith. The phrase was dismissed as metaphor. But the overlap is startling. The eye again, the child again, and curiously men not of our faith. Not Cathars, not Christians, someone else. One historical record grounds this. A 13th century Occitan poem, La Chanson de l'Oel, describes a falcon that flies from the sun to the snow, carrying a flame in its breast. It is not a mythic falcon, but a guide leading travelers to a stone temple where the breath waits. The imagery matches what we've seen before in scrolls from Akhmim, in murals at Monsonès, in rituals from the Templar annals. The falcon, the breath, the waiting, the implication. The Templars didn't just visit Egypt to unearth a mystery. They may have carried something or someone from there across the Mediterranean, through cloisters and caves, until they reached a final place of refuge. A sanctuary not only of stone, but of belief. There's a painting in the chapel of Saint-Bertrand de Comminges, dated to the 14th century, and long attributed to an anonymous monk. It shows the Montségur fortress on fire. But in the foreground, unnoticed by many, is a boy. He is walking away from the mountain. His head is turned toward the viewer. And hovering above his shoulder is a falcon. Not perched, hovering. Wings frozen mid-beat, as if waiting for something. The boy's eyes are closed. A controversial theory suggests that Montségur was never meant to be defended. It was meant to be a distraction. That while the Inquisition gathered around its walls, the true focus of the Templars and Cathars alike was smuggling a living secret out through the back, through paths only they knew, watched over by symbols only they understood. An open question lingers if a child bearing the lineage of Horus flesh of a forgotten god, marked by the eye, did survive into medieval Europe. How would one hide him? Where would one place such a person, not on a throne? Not in a church, but somewhere humble, somewhere no one would look. A monastery, perhaps, or a shepherd's home. Protected by knights who had long since stopped serving popes and started serving something older. The callback to earlier scrolls is now unavoidable. The phrase, "he knew the path before we spoke," it becomes more than mystical. It becomes logistical. If the child had been passed down through generations trained in silence marked in subtle ways, then perhaps the Templars weren't just chasing prophecy, they were fulfilling it. From Memphis to Montségur isn't just a distance, it's a passage, a relay. A handing off of something too delicate for power, too dangerous for faith. And wherever that child went, the eye followed, watching. It appeared in a fire. That's how many of these stories go not born, but burned into history. The manuscript was found in the ashes of a collapsed tower at the Abbey of Saint-Félix-Lorgueil, charred at the edges, but somehow intact at its core. No one knew where it came from. The monks had no record of it. It wasn't catalogued, nor was it written in Latin, French, or Greek. Its language was Aramaic, tangled with traces of early Syriac and obscure Hebrew idioms. But what made the pages infamous was not their tongue, it was the veil. Wrapped around the manuscript was a piece of crimson cloth, faded but rich like dried blood stitched into silk. It bore no embroidery, no sigils, just one tear along the edge, as if it had been torn in haste or grief. The monks called it the red veil, though they had no idea what it meant. They kept it locked away until a visiting Templar brother, Raymond of Rouen, saw it and reportedly went silent for 3 days. When he finally spoke, he asked for ink. What he added to the margins of the manuscript is as cryptic as the text itself. Within the seed of enemies, the twins are hidden. One will speak, the other will walk. He then left the abbey and was never heard from again. Historians have puzzled over this line ever since. Twins. Was this poetic language Gnostic allegory or something else? The manuscript, translated painstakingly over a century later, tells of a bloodline split in two. A sacred line preserved not in one child, but divided between siblings. The text speaks of a light hidden in shadow and the voice of the bird that walks without wings. It's bizarre, esoteric, but interwoven with descriptions that match almost precisely motifs seen earlier: the eye marked upon flesh, the child sheltered in silence, the watchers who bear no names. One factual anchor in the manuscript grounds this narrative: the mention of a group known as the Nazirites of the Dust. These were never a recognized order, but the name does appear in one fragment of a Dead Sea Scroll, referring to a sect of desert ascetics who take no wife, build no house, and carry the memory of the first light. Mainstream scholars have dismissed this as poetic, but a few insist these Nazirites were guardians of a lineage, not just a teaching. The Red Veil text also aligns with one unusual Templar artifact, a carved obsidian disc found in a ruined chapel near Lyon. The disc shows two eyes, one open, one shut, and a pair of falcons circling a central flame. On the edge, scratched almost illegibly, are the words, "One forgotten, one concealed," until the eye remembers. This feeds into a recurring theory, controversial and yet persistent, that the Templars believed the bloodline of Horus was not only real, but had been preserved through an intentional duality. That one twin, perhaps a literal sibling, perhaps a symbolic twin, was hidden while the other acted. A decoy and a vessel, a light and voice. And that only through ritual or lineage or celestial alignment could the truth be known. A callback emerges from the Akhmim scrolls. The term Netjerusa, the divine body lineage, may now refer to more than just succession. It may imply balance, polarity. That the line carried both protection and revelation, but never in the same person. Which would explain why the Templars sought not just a relic or a site, but two living heirs or the possibility of such division. The Red Veil itself, now lost, presumed destroyed during the French Revolution, was said to carry a faint scent like myrrh and burnt stone. Several who handled it reported strange dreams. Visions of stars of birds diving into oceans of a child seated in darkness, holding something that glowed. Skeptical minds call it the power of suggestion. But those who study sacred textiles point out that red veils were often used in Egyptian funerary rites, not for the dead, but for the unborn, a protective wrapping for children who were believed to carry something divine. And then there's the manuscript's final page. Scorched but partially restored, it reads, "If the eye is closed, the seed will sleep. If the eye opens, the world must forget. Until then, the breath shall wait where the stones do not speak." An open question remains: was this document a prophecy, a coded genealogy, or a ritual guide meant to protect something unspeakable? No direct links tie it to the Vatican. Yet one internal letter penned by a papal scribe in 1308 references a scarlet covering of heretical birth, seized during a raid on a southern French abbey. The letter is vague. The object is unnamed. But the description, crimson silk, torn edge scent of oils, is too specific to ignore. Perhaps the veil wasn't symbolic. Perhaps it was once wrapped around a child, or a scroll, or both. Perhaps it marked not death, but passage, a transition from myth into flesh, from temple into chapel, from Egypt into Europe. So we ask again, why would a manuscript written in a fading tongue wrapped in a forgotten cloth unsettle a Templar to the point of vanishing? What did he recognize? A symbol, a prophecy, or a memory, one carried not in words, but in blood. In Cairo's crowded Khan el-Khalili quarter, where the scent of cardamom and dust weaves through narrow alleys, the story still lingers, told only to those who ask the right way from the right lips. It speaks of a flower that blooms in the desert, a flower not of petals, but of people. A line, a legacy, protected for centuries by a group that never called itself a cult, never raised a temple, never wrote its name. They were known only by their mark, a single blue lotus inked behind the ear placed there when the child could first speak the old names. The name is important. The blue lotus was sacred to the ancient Egyptians, not just for its beauty, but for what it symbolized: rebirth, spiritual awakening, and divine lineage. In tombs, it's shown blooming from the mouths of gods and kings, and in one rare carving from a ruined shrine near Luxor, the flower is held not by a deity, but by a boy. A child with the eye of Horus marked faintly on his chest. This child is not kneeling, not supplicating. He is standing, alone. One fragment of oral tradition collected by a Jesuit traveler in the 17th century describes a desert people called Banu al-Nil al-Azraq, or Children of the Blue Nile. Their ancestry is unclear. Some claim Nubian origin. Others link them to exiled priesthoods after the fall of the Ptolemies. But all agree on one detail: they guarded something. Not a treasure, not a tomb, but a person. A child born once every few generations, marked by a sign seen only by the dying. The elders did not name the child. They called him Al-Warith, the inheritor. This tradition might have remained folklore, another curious myth tucked away in the footnotes of colonial journals, had it not been for a curious letter unearthed in a private collection in Marseille. Dated 1248 and addressed to a Templar preceptor in Tripoli, the letter includes a request to send cloth ink and pure water for the care of the blue child. The phrasing is odd. Blue child, a scribal error or a coded reference. The letter was signed with the symbol of the falcon, and the seal bears an unmistakable lotus bloom. It's here that a rare point of convergence appears. The Red Veil manuscript, with its mention of the twins, described one who would walk unknown with petals at his feet and silence at his side. And in the scrolls from Akhmim, a marginal note speaks of a guardian who does not age, who carries no blade, who smells always of crushed flowers. It sounds like poetry, but it might be something more literal, protective, cloaked in scent and myth for survival. The historical fact that anchors this mystery is the recorded arrest of a desert caravan outside Fayum in 1261. A local emir accused the travelers of hiding a fugitive child. When questioned, the caravan's leader claimed they were transporting spices, but when the wagons were searched, nothing was found. Nothing except a bundle of linens wrapped in lotus petals long since dried. No child was found, but that bundle was logged by the emir's scribe under the category ritual articles, then quietly erased from the ledger 2 weeks later. Templar documents from Cyprus written the following year include an encrypted note regarding a bloom that has not wilted and its carriers still faithful to the path. Again, there's no explanation, but the phrasing matches too many other references to dismiss as coincidence. Here comes the controversial interpretation that a group of desert guardians descended from priestly bloodlines had protected a child or series of children believed to carry the blood of Horus. That their method of protection was not steel or stone, but erasure. Concealment through beauty, through stories, through scent. It's no accident that the blue lotus induces altered states of consciousness. Egyptian texts speak of its use in rituals of passage and communion. Some scholars believe it was used to communicate with ancestors or gods. But what if it wasn't just ritual? What if the flower was chosen because of something deeper? A symbol recognized not only by Egyptians, but by those who came after. Crusaders, monks, guardians. There is a callback here, gentle but unavoidable, to the fresco in Monsonès, where a kneeling knight faces a child haloed not by gold, but by petals. A detail long assumed to be an artistic flourish. But perhaps it was memory, a record and image of something real. The open question remains, were the guardians of the Blue Lotus protectors of a symbolic tradition or of an actual lineage? And did the Templars contact them not to conquer, but to collaborate? There are no direct records. That is their genius, and perhaps their purpose. The guardians didn't leave scrolls. They left flowers, a few petals buried under stones, a fragrance that outlived names, a symbol that once seen repeats itself again and again in places no flower should bloom. In the 19th century, a French missionary reported seeing a blue lotus carved into a stone near the ruined Templar chapel of Saint Bernard. No one believed him. Flowers don't grow in stone, but sometimes history does. Quietly, elegantly, waiting. Dendera is strange even by Egyptian standards. While tourists flock to Luxor and Giza, those who seek older whispers find their way north past the banana groves and sugarcane fields to the Temple of Hathor. It's a sprawling celestial monument, its ceiling painted with stars, its columns covered in divine birth scenes. Most come to see the famous zodiac. Few ever glance at the side rooms where the shadows thicken and the inscriptions grow. Uncertain. In one of these chambers, deeper than most visitors ever walk, are two anomalies known simply as the mirror tablets. Not for their content, although that's strange enough, but for their surface. Polished black stone, unnaturally smooth, reflective even in dim light. Each tablet is carved with concentric ovals like ripples in a pond. And at the center of each, a falcon's eye, left-facing, tearless, empty. They were first recorded in 1798 during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, though even then, their inscriptions baffled scholars. They weren't hieroglyphs. They weren't Coptic. One general described the markings as the script of ghosts. It wasn't until the early 20th century that anyone thought to align the patterns geometrically. That's when things became unnerving. An astronomer from Cairo University, Amina Latif, overlaid star charts from the Old Kingdom period onto the tablets. The shapes matched, not randomly, deliberately, specifically. The curved ovals corresponded to paths of planets Mars, Venus, Sirius, and the central eye, it turned out, was positioned exactly where Sirius rises on the summer solstice, as viewed from Dendera, circa 2500 BCE. Now this could be a remarkable feat of ancient astronomy, or it could be something else. A peculiar Templar record stored in fragments at the Temple Church in London references the eyes that do not look outward but inward, the twin black mirrors of the desert temple. No location is named, no date given, but a separate line reads, "The eye in the stone calls to its own across the sea." At the time, no one connected this to Dendera, but the phrasing is hard to dismiss, especially in light of another oddity. In 1904, an archaeologist named Sir Raymond Everley claimed that when he stood between the two tablets during sunset on the equinox, he experienced auditory hallucinations. He described hearing the sound of wings, then whispers in a language like water over glass. His report was quietly filed away by the Antiquities Authority, and he was later diagnosed with exposure-induced delirium. But locals had long warned travelers not to linger in that room after dusk. They called it Beit al-Aynayn, the House of the Two Eyes. The open question becomes, were these tablets, ritual objects, star maps, something more? One controversial theory suggests they were alignment tools, not for the stars above, but for paths below. That each eye was a marker, and that if one knew how to read the pattern, one could follow a hidden path through the desert. A path not marked by roads, but by inheritance. Here's the historical fact that gives this weight. In 1227, a Templar envoy dispatched to Cairo recorded an unsuccessful negotiation with a desert priest near Dendera. The record refers to an object called Ain Tawayil, the long eye. It was described as a stone that remembers light and marks the heir's journey. The envoy's name was Guy de Sèvres, and his personal seal, preserved in the Musée de Cluny, features not a cross, but a falcon holding a circle in its claws. This isn't the only link. In the Red Veil manuscript, there is a line, "When the black mirrors face the same light, the heir will find his reflection." It sounds poetic. Until you're standing in Dendera's twin-eyed chamber, watching the sun creep toward that central ripple. A callback stirs from the earlier chapter at Akhmim, the genealogical scrolls marked by the eye arranged in circular patterns. Perhaps those records weren't lists. Perhaps they were coordinates. Perhaps the inheritance was not just blood, but direction. What complicates the narrative even more is the discovery in 1972 of a stone fragment found buried beneath the Templar chapel at Gisors. The fragment bore no inscription, just a carving of two concentric eyes set into black slate. Its surface was worn smooth as though polished by centuries of touch. Its dimensions match those of the Dendera tablets almost exactly. How did a carving from Upper Egypt, or at least made in its likeness, end up beneath a Templar fortress in northern France? One theory, radical but persistent, is that the Templars didn't just visit Dendera. They took something from it, or replicated it. That they encoded Egyptian cosmology into their European commanderies, not out of reverence but out of necessity, as if they believed the eye marked a path that could not be lost, a map that had to survive collapse, persecution, and fire. An echo from Monsonès returns here, the star-aligned fresco, the timing of the equinox light. The eye that watched. Maybe all these places, France, Egypt, Sinai, weren't random. Maybe they were waypoints on a forgotten path. A map not drawn with ink, but with reflection. The mirror tablets still sit in Dendera, unguarded, largely ignored. Tourists photograph the zodiac walk right past them. But when the sun hits just right and the shadows stretch long across the stone, the room grows oddly quiet. The mirrors catch the light. And for a moment, it feels less like you're looking at a relic, and more like something is looking back. There's something unnerving about eyes where they don't belong. Not statues, not portraits, those are expected. But in beams of chapels, on keystones of cloisters, in the backs of pews. Eyes that are barely visible unless the light hits just so. Always left-facing, always unblinking. And once you see one, you start seeing them everywhere. Across Europe, particularly in structures linked to the Templars, a curious motif repeats. Not overtly, never in grand frescoes or church facades, but in margins, in private chapels, in thresholds that separate sacred from secret. A single eye encircled by stylized wings or rays, sometimes paired with a falcon, sometimes with stars, sometimes with nothing at all. Historians long assumed these were adaptations of Christian iconography. The Eye of Providence, perhaps. But that symbol didn't gain popularity until centuries later. These carvings predate it, and they're different. more anatomical, more intimate. Less about divine omniscience, more about witness, presence, memory. One particularly compelling example lives in the Church of Santa Maria de Unate, a lonely octagonal structure in northern Spain attributed to the Templars. Inside, behind the altar, hidden beneath a removable panel of stone, is a carving almost no one knows exists. It depicts a child cradled in the arms of a faceless figure, and above them hovers a single eye leftward turned, its pupil a spiral. Beneath it, a single line in Latin, in silentio custoditur. In silence it is guarded. The historical fact that grounds this, the church sits along the Camino de Santiago, a pilgrimage route long believed to carry more than just faithful travelers. It was a Templar corridor peppered with commanderies and safe houses. If something were to be moved discreetly, something living, fragile, sacred, this would be the route. One account, written by a French pilgrim in 1281, mentions an encounter with a group of knights dressed not in white, but in dark cloaks embroidered with faint blue thread. He wrote of a boy among them, no older than 12, who walked as though he had walked for centuries, and who did not speak, but whom they treated as one speaks to stars. It's poetic, but not singular. A similar account comes from a Bavarian abbot in 1293 who wrote in his private diary, not in official records, of a child received at the Abbey of Index, carried under the symbol of the single eye. The boy, he notes, bore a mark on his shoulder shaped like a curved feather or wing. He stayed only one night. No name was given. The abbot was told only to feed him, shelter him, and forget him. A callback stirs here from the guardians of the Blue Lotus, who used no names, no titles, only signs, and the Red Veil manuscript, which spoke of the twin bearers, one who would walk unknown. Perhaps this eye was their passphrase, a recognition token, not a relic, but a signal. Like a seal broken only by those who understood what it meant to protect the blood of gods. A controversial interpretation by historian Dr. Miriam Lang posits that this eye imagery was not simply devotional art, but a form of encoded communication among Templar outposts. That certain chapels were designed not as places of worship, but as stations, vaulted thresholds between worlds. Europe was the vault. Egypt was the key. Dr. Lang's research uncovered architectural correspondences between the Templar chapel at Laon and older Egyptian structures near Abydos, matching ratios, shared alignments, even similar acoustic properties. Both echoed at the same frequency when sound was struck at their centers. An accident or design carried across continents, encoded in stone. And then there's the matter of the sealed letters. In the Vatican's suppressed registry, 4 sealed letters addressed to unnamed recipients bear only a single seal, not a cross, but an eye within a circle. They were written in 1306, the year before the arrest of the Templars began. One was intercepted, its contents never released. But the scribe who copied the opening line wrote, "It is moving again. The eye must close until Europe forgets." The phrase is chilling, suggesting not just concealment, but dormancy. As if the eye represented something active, sentient, reactive. Not divine in the theological sense, but awake in the historical one. The open question remains if these eyes were part of a broader network, visual codes embedded across sacred geography. What were they meant to do? Signal, shield, record. The fresco in the Templar round church of Verona might offer a clue. It shows a falcon flying above a sea of stars, and below it a sleeping child surrounded by robed figures. The caption beneath reads, "Ut videat iterum," that he may see again. Perhaps the eye isn't a watcher. Perhaps it's waiting to be opened. We've seen the trail from the Nile to the Pyrenees, from falcon rings to mirrored tablets, from blue petals to red veils. But what's most haunting is not what the Templars left behind, it's what they saw fit to carry forward. Quietly, constantly, in plain sight and never explained. The eye that watches Europe is not in any one chapel or scroll. It's stitched through time like a shadow in motion. It does not blink. It does not weep. It waits. He appears rarely, almost never by name. But in texts scattered across continents and centuries, there are glimmers, half-shadowed glimpses of a figure that defies categorization. Not a king, not a god, not quite a priest, and yet always central, always sacred. The child of two lines, the bearer of two crowns, one born not just of blood, but of alignment. The Egyptian Book of the Dead speaks of he who sits between Osiris and Horus, a transitional soul sometimes interpreted as the initiate on the path to divine awakening. But a far older fragmentary inscription from a pre-dynastic stone palette found near Hierakonpolis tells of a boy whose father was of the sky and whose mother bore the mark of earth. The inscription is dismissed by many as creation myth, but recent reassessment suggests the phrase could describe an actual person, a hybrid of dynasties born of convergence, not myth. This theory gained renewed interest when a 12th century Syriac manuscript, rediscovered in the Armenian monastery of San Lazzaro, mentioned a child of the two thrones hidden until the stars return. Scholars were baffled. The phrase two thrones appears in both Egyptian and Byzantine contexts. In Egypt, it referred to upper and lower kingdoms. In Byzantium, it denoted the division between temporal and divine rule. But the manuscript wasn't political. It was genealogical. A lineage traced through female scribes ending with a single entry, one child born when the moon swallowed the sun. A clear reference to a solar eclipse. When dated, the timing aligns with a known celestial event over Alexandria in 1163. Here's the historical fact that makes this more than a footnote. In the same year, a group of Templar envoys arrived in Alexandria under unknown pretenses. Their presence is noted by both local imams and European chroniclers, but no mission is recorded. No battle, no treaty, just their arrival, and then their disappearance. A callback glows faintly here from the mirror tablets of Dendera, where the eye sat at the convergence of planetary paths. The concept of alignment runs deeper than metaphor. It's mathematical, predictable, as if someone or some group was waiting for the right configuration, not to build something, but to be born. The child of both thrones may not have been royalty in the traditional sense. The Red Veil manuscript, with its veiled twins, speaks of one who sits unseen, the joining of the first breath and the final silence. And the Akhmim scrolls list a generation in which the heir is carried by a mother not of the seed, but of the sign. This would suggest adoption, or more symbolically, the selection of a vessel by criteria older than kingship's celestial ritual or prophetic. This blends into a controversial hypothesis that the Horus lineage, having splintered after dynastic collapse, was not preserved by inheritance alone, but by careful recombination. That at certain moments in history, when the signs aligned, eclipses, planetary convergences, equinox crossings, children were born or found who embodied the right convergence of blood, geography, and symbol. The eye didn't simply mark them, it chose them. One marginal note from the Templar fortress at Acre supports this. It describes a child of the upper and lower breath, a phrase repeated nowhere else. But the accompanying drawing is clear, a boy standing between two falcons, one with open wings, one with folded. Above him, a single star. Below him, a well. An open question persists: if this child of both thrones existed not as a myth, but as a real person, what was done with him, hidden, trained, or used? One record from a Cathar stronghold at Rocaficsad hints at a visitor of foreign tongue who brought the boy of silence. That boy was said to speak in dreams, to draw symbols no one taught him. He was protected, then vanished. The Cathars claimed no knowledge, but one priest wrote before being burned, the two made one, the lion and the bird. He will not return until the thrones are broken. The symbols appear again in an illuminated psalter from the British Isles, date unknown, where a child stands barefoot between a lion and a falcon. He holds neither cross nor scepter, but a simple staff topped with a blue flower. At his feet, the eye, and behind him an eclipse. That image was painted on vellum, but some believe it came from memory, from sight. So what do we make of this? The convergence of dynasties, both sacred and secular. A bloodline born not just from royalty, but from purpose. Perhaps the child of both thrones was not the culmination of the Horus lineage, but its hinge, a point of renewal, a junction where myth became flesh again. And if the Templars knew of this child, or even witnessed one such emergence, it would explain everything: the secrecy, the movement, the architectural alignments, the falcon motifs carved in stone far from Egypt. The eye that watches may not be static. Perhaps it opens only when someone worthy sees through it. And perhaps once someone did. Not all royal blood flows in palaces. Some vanishes into the desert, buried not by time, but by intent. In the southern reaches of Egypt and into the lands of ancient Nubia, a different lineage pulses just beneath the sand, quiet, persistent, and deliberately neglected. Here, far from the well-mapped courts of Memphis and Thebes, oral tradition has preserved something scholars refuse to see: a queen without a kingdom, and a child who vanished like wind in stone. Nubian memory is long, passed down in songs, stories carved into wood rather than stone. One such tale, collected by ethnographer D.F. Raswan in the 1890s, describes a woman of northern fire and southern skin who gave birth under a blood moon. The child was said to carry the mark of the air and was hunted by men with red crosses who did not speak our tongue, but bore fire without smoke. At the time, the tale was dismissed as colonial-era embroidery. But one phrase stood out: the child who drank stars. It appears again in a Nubian funerary chant from the 13th century, unearthed near Dongola, which laments a falcon blood boy born of two rivers, taken beyond the dune line by ghost men in white. Templars. The connection seems speculative until you factor in a 1292 report from a Coptic priest named Johanna, preserved in a side ledger of the Vatican's Eastern Mission archives. Johanna wrote of a pale foreigner and a dark-robed queen arriving at his monastery seeking shelter. He noted the child with them quiet eyes, alert, wrapped in blue linen, embroidered with what he called the winged sun split in half. He assumed the man was a merchant, the woman a noblewoman in exile. But when he awoke the next morning, they were gone, and so were 3 of the monastery's scrolls, including one detailing ancient rites of the Horus cult at Com Ombo. The trail doesn't end there. An 18th century travelogue by Swiss adventurer Hans Brecht includes a bizarre description of ruins found in the Bayuda Desert. A small circular shrine built from pink sandstone, unadorned, save for a carving above the lintel, a falcon perched atop a throne of thorns. Brecht thought it Persian, but its structure matches known early Christian Nubian sanctuaries, and beneath the shrine was a single sarcophagus, long since broken and empty. No artifacts, just a single obsidian bead and a scrap of silk dyed deep red, preserved only because it had never been exposed to sunlight. A callback stirs here, echoing the Red Veil manuscript, and the child passed into safety by men not of our faith. Perhaps this desert queen, never named in any formal record, was a vessel of preservation, not of wealth, but of inheritance. A mobile sanctum, a living archive. It also calls back to the guardians of the Blue Lotus who preserved not doctrine but a person, a lineage embodied in silence. Maybe Nubia wasn't an endpoint. Maybe it was a waypoint chosen for its remoteness, for its silence, for its long memory. One controversial interpretation from Professor Saadia Rami of the University of Khartoum posits that this desert queen may have descended from the old priest kings of Napata, whose bloodlines intermarried with Egyptian dynasties during the 25th dynasty. She argues that this matrilineal link made Nubia not a fringe but a fallback. When Egypt fell to conquest after conquest, those who bore the eye's legacy fled south into the sands, into forgotten kingdoms, into the bodies of women who knew how to carry secrets. The open question becomes, if the Templars did escort such a woman and child northward or westward, where did they go? And why are there no official records? Perhaps because it was never official. Perhaps it was a mission kept separate, hidden even from the order's hierarchy. In 1325, after the dissolution of the Templars, a small chapel was constructed in southern Portugal under the Knights of Christ, their official successor. Above the door, carved into an otherwise plain stone facade, is a falcon, its wings not spread but folded. Beneath it, a throne with 2 points, and in the center, the faint, unmistakable carving of a crowned child. Perhaps she got there. The queen, the child. Perhaps they vanished across continents the way they vanished from scripture deliberately. Because what survives in stone can be broken. What survives in blood must be hidden. And so in a corner of Nubia, the desert still sings. The wind shifts sand off cracked ruins no one bothers to mark. And in the oldest lullabies, they still sing of the boy with bird eyes who was carried west by men of smoke, whose mother walked 3 days without water, and who, when asked his name, said only, "I am not finished." They were meticulous, the Templars. Every document sealed, every scroll stamped, every missive pressed with wax under the weight of iron. Most seals bore the familiar image, 2 knights on a single horse or a simple cross, emblems of poverty, brotherhood, faith. But once in a while, a different seal appears, rare, unofficial, and ignored for centuries. A falcon, not just any bird of prey, but one mid-flight, claws outstretched, and beneath it a boy, not kneeling, standing, crowned. The seal has no official registry. It doesn't show up in lists of known insignias, but it exists pressed into a strip of parchment discovered in a collapsed Templar outpost outside Jerusalem, dated roughly to 1274. The document it marked is too damaged to read, but the seal is remarkably clear. A boy's silhouette, a falcon above, and beneath them 2 Latin words, sa necher, the divine body. This phrase appears nowhere else in Templar records, but it has unmistakable Egyptian roots. Sa necher, a term denoting not only the sacred body of a god, but specifically the divine essence manifest in physical form. In ancient funerary texts, it refers to the transformation of the deceased into something eternal. But what if it was used here? Not in death, but in life. It's a jarring suggestion that the Templars, Christian warriors sworn to Rome, were stamping secret documents with an Egyptian term that implies incarnation. More than belief, recognition. The existence of the seal might have remained a curiosity if not for a parallel discovery in the Templar archives of Tomar, Portugal. A similar stamp, but this time carved into a stone ledger box bearing the same falcon and crowned boy, only this version includes stars circling his head. 12. One for each constellation, That same pattern appears in a fresco at Monsonès, already explored earlier in this investigation. A gentle callback, the 12 red stars encircling a falcon-headed figure painted decades before Napoleon ever stepped foot in Egypt. Perhaps that image wasn't just art, it was a code, a memory rendered in geometry and color. In a suppressed record from the Council of Vienne convened to officially dissolve the order, one inquisitor noted that among the Templars' possessions seized at Béziers was a stone seal bearing pagan motifs, bird and boy, suggestive of Eastern heresies. No image survives, but the description aligns too precisely to ignore. What's most chilling is what the inquisitor wrote next. No brother would admit knowledge of its meaning, yet all bowed to it when it was placed upon the altar. That isn't behavior tied to ornament, it's reverence, ritual, recognition. A controversial interpretation by Dr. Hadrian Solis suggests that the Falcon Prince was not a title but a role, that from time to time when the stars aligned and bloodlines converged, the Templars believed a child was born, who embodied the Sa Netcher, a divine presence in human form, not to be worshipped, but to be protected. Not a messiah, but a signal. The fulfillment of something older than Scripture. Solis goes further. He argues that this child once identified was not raised by the order, but moved through it, carried like a whisper from one safe place to the next. From the desert sands of Egypt to the fortress keeps of southern France, shielded not by fortresses but by silence. An open question complicates everything. How would the Templars have known who the Falcon Prince was if the child bore no name, no claim, no army? What marked him? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps it was only belief, a set of signs, a birth under certain stars, a mark on the skin, a pattern of dreams, or perhaps, as suggested in the Red Veil manuscript, it was something instinctual, a resonance. Hearts bowed before they understood. That line is vague, yes, but it's also consistent with the account from the Cathar mountain priest, who claimed that the boy made the knights weep when he touched the eye carved in stone. A callback to the eye again, always watching, always reappearing. Perhaps the eye wasn't just a symbol of guardianship. Perhaps it was the key used to recognize the heir. If so, the seal of the Falcon Prince wasn't decorative. It was verification, a confirmation among those who already knew. Those who had walked the desert read the scrolls, knelt before the tablets, seen the mark. The boy beneath the falcon was not a metaphor. He was memory in flesh. And his crown, simple, weightless, etched in wax, was not the crown of a king. It was the sign of inheritance, something the world had forgotten, but a few had never stopped carrying forward. And maybe, just maybe, it's still being carried. Axum rises slowly from the dust. Its obelisks lean like memory, sharp, and still casting long shadows over a city that once crowned emperors, and now watches goats shuffle past ancient stones. Ethiopia has always been a land apart, never conquered, never fully mapped. Its Christianity is old, older even than Rome's embrace of the cross, and its legends. Well, its legends reach deep. Among them is one that flickers oddly close to the story we've been following. The tale of a boy not royal by birth, not divine by decree, but chosen, a child of the eye. A phrase not Ethiopian in origin, but whispered in the mountain churches of Lalibela, in the cool corridors of rock-hewn sanctuaries that bleed red earth. He is said to have come from the north, across burning lands, accompanied by pale-skinned men who walked silently and asked no questions. They bore no weapons, but one carried a scroll. In 1322, the Italian monk Francesco Alvarez wrote of a prince without court, seen in the company of strange brethren who made no signs of the cross yet bowed before the altar. He found this curious, but dismissed it as a local oddity. Yet another European traveler, the Portuguese Jesuit Pedro Paes, visiting Ethiopia nearly 3 centuries later, recorded a story passed down by priests in Axum of a child of stars who bore the breath of 2 lands. The phrasing doesn't make sense, unless you know what to listen for. Breath, eye, north, pale nights. These words echo through the investigation like a drumbeat beneath layers of language. A callback pulses from Nubia, where the desert queen was said to have vanished westward with a child marked not by lineage, but by sign. And further back from Dendera's mirrored tablets and the Red Veil's twins. The same constellation of themes keeps reappearing: guardians, silence encoded recognition stars overhead, and always a child. What's most fascinating is a carved panel in the Church of St. Mary of Zion, long believed to house the Ark of the Covenant. The panel, barely noticed until recently, shows a boy standing between 2 falcons beneath a stylized eye. The inscription beneath it reads, "He who walks among watchers." No date is given, no name. But Ethiopian script scholars agree it's at least 700 years old. The Templars had no recorded missions in Ethiopia, but a document found in the archives of the Knights of Christ in Tomar, a successor organization, mentions brothers lost beyond the Nile and a fragment of the line delivered to the highlands. Delivered, not retrieved, not converted. Delivered. The implication being that Ethiopia wasn't a detour, it was a destination. This aligns with a curious historical fact. Several Ethiopian emperors, particularly in the Zagwe dynasty, claimed descent not only from Solomon and Sheba, but from a line hidden even from kings, a line protected by priests passed not through power, but through prophecy. Oral tradition insists that certain children chosen at birth were placed in monasteries never crowned, never named, raised, to preserve something not of this world. And then there's the Garima Gospels, 2 illuminated manuscripts kept in a remote monastery in the Tigray region. One page, largely unstudied, shows a child in white walking across a desert under a canopy of stars. A falcon flies above him, and in the sky, an open eye. The symbolism is unmistakable, but the date, 6th century, predating the Templars by hundreds of years, which suggests that the story, the bloodline, the eye, the guardianship existed long before the Knights ever began their search. So what if the Templars weren't the source of the mystery, but its latest custodians? A controversial interpretation by Dr. Lemi Dawit, an Ethiopian anthropologist, suggests that the Falcon lineage was absorbed into Ethiopian tradition, not biologically, but liturgically. That children chosen to carry its legacy became part of a closed monastic cycle, appearing only at intervals, their identities hidden, their knowledge passed in riddles and dreams. She argues that these children were never meant to rule, only to remind. The open question, of course, is whether any of this is literal. Did a child descended from Horus, from Egypt's sacred line, from a bloodline watched by stars and protected by silence, actually live and walk among the highlands of Ethiopia? Perhaps the better question is this: how is it that so many of the same motifs, eye, falcon, bloodline, silence, exile, keep emerging in places the Templars touched and in places they never officially reached? Maybe the truth isn't where the Knights went. Maybe it's what followed them. And if Ethiopia was the last resting place of that legacy, not in a tomb, but in a heartbeat, then perhaps the eye never closed. It simply turned its gaze toward higher ground. The clay was brittle, crumbling at the edges, like it was trying to forget. Dug up from the outskirts of Sinjar in northern Mesopotamia, it wasn't the kind of artifact anyone expected to be relevant. A single tablet, unglazed, marked in cuneiform, barely legible even under angled light. For years, it sat in a museum storeroom in Mosul, mislabeled as a minor agricultural inventory. But in 2004, a graduate student from the University of Erbil retranslated a handful of its symbols, and suddenly the fragment was no longer about grain. The words read more like prophecy than record. When the breath of the eye moves east, the Avenger King shall rise. The crescent shall bend, and the falcon will weep where the black stone sleeps. It's pure poetry. But it was dated, confirmed through stratigraphy and associated pottery, to roughly 1400 BCE, a time long before organized crusades, long before the Templars. And yet, there it was, the falcon, the eye, the weeping, symbols that by now feel less like metaphor and more like code. Here's the historical fact. The region around Sinjar has long been home to the Yazidi people, a group whose theology contains unique cosmologies, elements of angelic guardianship, cycles of exile, and a peacock angel who descends in flame. Scholars often link these to pre-Zoroastrian beliefs or ancient Mesopotamian frameworks. But tucked within certain oral stories rarely recorded is the tale of Malak Ta'ir, the angel bird. A protector sent not to judge but to hide. His charge, a child of stars born under twin thrones who must pass through fire to awaken. It echoes earlier chapters like a soft breath, the child of both thrones, the eye that watches the red veil's silent twins. And now again, the theme resurfaces, this time etched in clay in the shadow of a mountain range long whispered to be sacred. A controversial interpretation by Dr. Gabriel Mercier, a linguistic archaeologist, argues that the Sinjar fragment isn't native to Mesopotamian literary tradition at all. He claims the language, while cuneiform, is laced with loan structures from ancient Egyptian, particularly in how the word avenger is constructed. It borrows the Egyptian root hr Shemsu, which some believe refers to Horus not as a deity, but as a title, the one who follows. If that's true, then the Sinjar fragment may be the oldest textual artifact referring to a living heir of the Horus tradition, an Avenger King, not mythic, but flesh-bound. Someone who wasn't meant to rule but to return. And that's where the Templars, centuries later, may have connected the dots. In a battered Templar codex found in Acre, barely legible after mold damage, a sentence in Latin reads, "When the sign of the falcon meets the stone of the east, we are to follow the breath, not the sword." At first it made little sense, but when cross-referenced with the Sinjar fragment's mention of the falcon weeping, where the black stone sleeps, a new picture emerges. Sinjar is not far from regions that were once called the Stone Deserts, in Templar maps, areas feared not for physical danger, but for their spiritual density. Areas of silence, of visions, of strange dreams. The Templars may have ventured there not for conquest, but for confirmation. A callback now becomes unavoidable, the mirror tablets of Dendera, which marked celestial paths rather than political ones. The eye, the falcon, the alignments all could suggest a map not only of space but of time. And perhaps the Sinjar site was one of the final destinations. A terminal point in a path that began beneath the sands of Heliopolis and wound through the mountains of memory. One open question lingers. The Sinjar fragment speaks of the falcon weeping. This isn't traditional prophecy language. It suggests loss, grief. Perhaps something went wrong. Perhaps the child or the line was found, but not kept. Or maybe as the Templars began to fall, the line was hidden again, buried deeper than parchment, deeper than stone. A small stone amulet uncovered near the Sinjar dig site bears a symbol rarely seen outside Egypt, a left-facing eye enclosed within an oval cartouche. No inscription, no name, just the eye watching. And so we ask, what did the Templars learn when they reached this edge of the map? Did they confirm the child's survival? Did they pass something on? or were they too late, arriving only in time to bury memory one last time? Whatever the truth, the fragment remains. Silent. Fired in clay 4,000 years ago. And yet somehow, still watching. In the monastery's deepest chamber below the chapel floor, where pilgrims once knelt in silence, a forgotten slab concealed a secret. Not a tomb, not a relic, a map. And not just any map, a constellation carved in patterns too ancient for Latin, too intentional for coincidence. St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai is old, one of the oldest Christian monasteries still in use. But beneath its ancient walls lies something stranger than scripture. A star chart aligned not to Bethlehem or Rome, but to Heliopolis, Dendera, and Abydos. Egyptian cities of the divine, cities of Horus. For centuries, this level of the monastery had been sealed off by a rockfall during an earthquake. It wasn't until the 1960s, during a stabilization project funded by the Egyptian Department of Antiquities, that workers rediscovered it. In a room no larger than a cattle stall, a carved ceiling had survived almost untouched. Faint gold leaf still clung to the stars, but it was the pattern that puzzled everyone. The stars weren't random. They weren't symbolic. They were directional routes, perhaps connecting celestial markers to terrestrial coordinates. Historians at first assumed this was a Christian cosmological chart. But one researcher, a Benedictine monk named Father Adriano, recognized something different. The chart wasn't centered on Jerusalem. It was centered on Orion's belt. The three stars lined up perfectly with the pyramids of Giza, and extending from that triad was a long arc of additional markings, matching the positions of ruins, oases, and forgotten trade routes across the eastern desert. The Templars had passed through here. Their insignia, faintly etched on a sandstone pillar, had been dated to the early 1200s. And Father Adriano's notes revealed something chilling when he overlaid the monastery's star chart with medieval Templar route maps. The alignment was exact. Each star corresponded to a Templar station, but the last star didn't match any known outpost. It pointed to the central Sinai Plateau, an area long considered inhospitable, empty, sacred, or perhaps hidden. A previous chapter's reference to the mirror tablets of Dendera now takes on new relevance. Those tablets weren't just decorative, they were navigational, and their alignment with this Sinai chart suggests coordination across centuries. The Templars weren't just retracing Egyptian pilgrimage routes. They were reconstructing an older geography, one not based on borders or kingdoms, but on celestial resonance. Here's the historical fact: the Templars did establish a station near Ras Suder, a coastal point that provided access into the central desert. Crusader archives mention supply routes that seem excessive, too much food, too much water for a post that saw little combat. But desert traditions, including Bedouin oral maps, describe ancient wells and stone markers leading inland toward a ridge known as Gebel el Magara, the Cave Mountain. A recently uncovered fragment of a Templar field diary, now housed in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, mentions the eye that hides beneath the ridge. While most dismissed it as metaphor, others believe this referred to a physical destination, perhaps even a chamber or tomb tied to Horus's lineage. If so, then the map beneath St. Catherine's may have been both a key and a warning. One open scholarly debate revolves around whether the Templars could have even deciphered Egyptian astronomical systems. Egyptology, after all, didn't formally begin until the 19th century. But some point to the influence of Syriac and Arabic scholars during the Crusades, many of whom preserved ancient knowledge in texts untranslated by the Latin West. If the Templars had access to these sources, it's not impossible that they reconstructed more than we assume. A callback emerges from the Red Veil manuscript, which spoke of a seed placed where star and dust entwine. That phrasing now seems less cryptic. If the seed was a bloodline, a child, a relic, or a legacy, and if the entwining point was Sinai, then the Templars may have been tasked not with recovery, but with preservation. So what did the map beneath the monastery mean to them? Was it a path of pilgrimage, a protective shield, or the final leg in a journey begun at Heliopolis, chased through Akhmim, echoed in Nubia, and whispered in Sinjar? The answers remain half-lit. But the geometry doesn't lie. The stars, the roads, the hidden chambers, they all point toward a convergence. And in the center of that convergence sits St. Catherine's. Not just a monastery, perhaps a waypoint, perhaps a lock. Today, visitors walk its tiled halls unaware. Tourists admire the icons, the manuscripts, the wild roses blooming in the sunlit courtyard. But far beneath their feet, the map waits. Its stars still shining silent, unblinking, like eyes in the stone. It always sounds absurd the first time you hear it, that someone walking among us might carry a drop of divine blood. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but quite literally. A descendant of Horus traced through war desert, crusade exile and silence. Yet here, after all the crypts and stars and scattered scrolls, comes the strangest twist of all. That the Templars may not have been chasing a dead god. They may have been protecting a living legacy, not to exalt, not to exploit, but to shield. Because if that bloodline ever did resurface, the world might try to erase it again. The theory was first whispered in a coded letter from 1342 penned by a Templar who had fled persecution and found refuge in Avignon. His words were careful, cautious, but one line stands out. The falcon's seed has flown across the water and now grows beneath lilies and wolves. Historians debated the meaning, but some interpreted this as a cryptic reference to the French and English royal symbols fleur-de-lis and lion. A suggestion, perhaps, that the line had been absorbed into European nobility. There's a historical precedent for this kind of migration. After the fall of the Templars in 1312, a number of high-ranking members disappeared into obscurity. While many were arrested or executed, others simply vanished. Entire Templar properties were seized, except a few in remote places like Portugal, Scotland, and the Pyrenees, where orders continued under new names or no names at all. If any surviving group had been tasked with hiding or protecting a living heir, this scattering would have been the perfect cover. One curious detail comes from a genealogical chart discovered in a 16th century convent in Aragon. The chart features a series of names and dates that align with known Templar figures, but it branches off into a parallel line, unnamed, unrecorded, marked only by a symbol, a falcon overlaid with a crown. The last entry in that line was dated 1501 and was annotated with a single Latin phrase, sub rosa, under the rose. Now to some, this is just another flourish of Renaissance mysticism. But that same phrase, sub rosa, appeared earlier in the Red Veil manuscript, and again in the Sinjar fragment. It isn't just poetic, it was a signal. In medieval code, it meant secrecy, hidden knowledge, protected lineage, a warning, or a promise. The open debate today revolves around how far such a line could plausibly survive. Genetics, geography, the sheer randomness of history, all argue against continuity. But the counter-argument isn't certainty, it's consistency. The same names, the same symbols, the same obsession across centuries. If it's all fantasy, why does it echo so precisely? A callback to the Falcon seal at Monsonès brings this idea full circle. That chapel, remote and quiet, holds a fresco of a crowned falcon child surrounded by stars. Beneath it is carved one phrase in Provençal "Le sang vieux." The blood lives. That phrase would appear again in an unexpected place within a marginal note in a 19th century French family Bible passed down quietly through a noble line that once claimed descent not from Charlemagne, but from a desert queen. The handwriting didn't match the rest of the entries. It had been added almost invisibly between pages recounting Exodus. Which brings us to the final controversial point, not just that the bloodline of Horus may have survived, but that it was deliberately woven into dynasties. Not as kings, as advisors, as protectors, as watchers. The idea was not to dominate. It was to endure. The Vatican, of course, has never acknowledged any of this, but it did seal several rooms in the Lateran Palace after 1313, one of which, according to restricted inventory records, contained objects of desert origin and materials deemed heretical to established apostolic history. Some modern theorists suggest the line may have thinned or ended, that it was symbolic by the 1800s, absorbed into the bones of ordinary life. Others believe it never stopped entirely, that descendants live quietly, unaware of the legacy in their blood, marked only by dreams, instincts, or uncanny familiarity with symbols they've never studied. Of course, none of this can be proven, not in the way a museum demands. The papyrus is too burnt, the DNA is too mixed, the frescoes are too faded, but sometimes the persistence of a whisper is more telling than a scream. You might pass one on the street. You might have already. Someone with eyes just a little too old, a gaze that holds centuries, a strange birthmark perhaps, or a recurring dream of falcons circling under a desert sun. Not proof, but not nothing. Because if the Templars did trace the bloodline of Horus, if they carried it, guarded it, hid it, then maybe they didn't fail. Maybe the desert didn't take everything. Maybe the blood lives. There are rooms inside the Vatican that haven't been opened in over 700 years. Some are locked behind ornate iron gates sealed with wax and Latin inscriptions. Others don't even appear on official maps. They are the blind spots in the most documented state in the world, quiet, windowless, forgotten on purpose. And according to one suppressed inventory, one of those rooms once held a scroll wrapped in falcon feathers, marked with a seal that did not belong to any known papal office. The inventory was dated March 1311, just months before the final assault on the Templars began. The official records say it was a year of consolidation, of reviewing assets, of investigating heresy. But underneath that bureaucratic fog lay something stranger, something urgent. Because while King Philip of France pushed for the total dissolution of the Templar order, a parallel effort inside the Lateran Palace was underway, not to destroy the Templars' legacy, but to absorb it, quietly, surgically, and maybe to contain it. The trail begins with a papal chamberlain named Guglielmo de Lapo, a figure most historians barely register. But his private logs discovered in a sealed folio in the Vatican secret archive mention a box from the East, delivered by 3 unnamed riders and received not by the Pope, but by a shadow council operating outside of public view. Lapo's handwriting is uneven in that entry. Shaky. He refers to what was inside only as il sangue del cielo, the blood of the sky. And he notes with visible discomfort that its arrival confirms the worst suspicions. That phrase is underlined twice. This box and its contents were never seen again. But that same month, a previously unused chamber in the Vatican was sealed with lead. A chamber previously used to store Egyptian relics acquired during the brief Crusader control of Alexandria. Several of those relics had reportedly been passed through Templar hands for inspection and theological examination. According to the inventory, none of those relics were ever returned. A falcon motif appears again, this time on a carved alabaster staff wrapped in linen and stored beside a bundle of ancient papyrus scrolls. The staff bears inscriptions not in Latin, but in Demotic Egyptian. One phrase recurs, "the watcher who does not sleep," a reference perhaps to the Eye of Horus, or something more literal, a protector, a guardian bloodline. But this is where the evidence hits the edge of the known. The chamber was walled off entirely during renovations in the 1700s, its records marked prohibitum perpetuum, permanently restricted. And yet, a curious notation appears again in a 1906 internal memorandum concerning the relics sealed in the Egyptian room. Maintains silence. No mention of contents. No request for confirmation. Just a reminder to remain quiet, even after 6 centuries. Theories about what was inside range from sacred texts to bodily remains. Some speculate that the Templars had recovered not just evidence of a bloodline, but an actual descendant, a living person. Perhaps too young to understand what they carried, perhaps already dead. The point is not what they found, but how the Vatican reacted. Not with fury, but with fear. If the bloodline was real, and if the Templars had found it, the implications would have shattered foundational Christian theology. It would have reframed Christ not as the divine exception, but as part of a broader, older legacy of god-kings. Horus, Osiris, even the divine pharaohs, all part of the same sacred DNA. The Church could not afford that. Not in the 14th century. Not ever. This wasn't just suppression, it was substitution. The official records reframe the Templars as heretics. Their symbols, once honored, were recast as satanic. Their rituals, once blessed, now whispered about as dark. And yet the Vatican kept their relics. Not destroyed, not discarded, contained. One scholar, a Jesuit archivist who requested anonymity, put it this way: "You don't burn what you fear. You bury it where only the faithful can find it again." The archive also contains a letter from an unnamed bishop in Arles, dated 2 years after the Templars' fall. He writes of dreams filled with birds, of watching eyes, of a boy who walks without making sound. It would be laughable if it weren't filed under the heading Templar residue. That label appears nowhere else in the archive. Of course, there are those who believe the Vatican acted with righteousness, that any threat to the moral foundation of Christianity, no matter how historical or speculative, must be neutralized. But that logic assumes guilt. It assumes the bloodline was dangerous, and maybe it was, or maybe it simply didn't fit. But as the evidence circles back from Heliopolis to Dendera, from Nubia to the Pyrenees, it always seems to end in Rome. Not with a triumphant revelation, but a quiet lock, a final chamber, a truth too disruptive to confess. So the Vatican sealed the archive, but the whispers never stopped. You followed the trail across sands and stone, through whispers etched in papyrus and carved into falcon-headed seals. You've walked beside vanished knights and silent scribes, through ruined temples and secret chapels where a single image, the eye, the falcon, the child, flickered like a flame that refused to die. Now comes the quietest, most dangerous question of all: was any of it real? It's tempting, of course, to want it to be. Human memory is soft clay, easily shaped by longing, especially when it comes to mysteries wrapped in bloodlines and god-kings. But if we're to take stock of what we've unearthed, the question is not merely whether a Horus bloodline existed, but whether the Templars truly believed they were tracing it. And more unsettling still, why they believed it mattered. Let's start with what is irrefutable: the Templars had access to Egyptian antiquities long before Napoleon's so-called discovery of Egypt. Trade routes from Alexandria, coupled with their holdings in Jerusalem, and proximity to early Coptic communities placed them in a unique position to gather scrolls, statues, and oral traditions, much of it undocumented by the Church. Their presence in places like Akhmim and Heliopolis, though still hotly debated, is corroborated by architectural anomalies and contemporary Arab chronicles. These weren't just wayward knights stumbling into tombs, they were methodical, even obsessed. Then there are the symbols, the eye, the falcon, the repeated references in ritual manuscripts to light bearers, watchers, and a child of two thrones. These don't appear in Christian liturgy. They don't belong in Latin theological documents. And yet they're there in frescoes at Monsonès, in seals buried in the French countryside, in side margins of Templar confessions, supposedly extracted under torture, all repeating the same motifs. Could this simply be syncretism? A spiritual blending born of exposure to foreign religions? Possibly, but it doesn't explain the secrecy, nor the consistency, nor the lengths the Templars went to preserve these references even when facing death. Some argue the bloodline was metaphorical, symbolic of divine authority passed from age to age. Others believe it was literal, a child or family carrying DNA tied to ancient priest-kings protected for millennia by desert cults, and later adopted, perhaps even manipulated by the Templars as a living relic. And then there are those who claim it never existed at all. That this was merely another medieval fantasy, a Camelot of sand and stars. But that last explanation struggles when faced with one final truth: the Vatican's reaction. Sealing off rooms, rewriting archives, recasting the Templars not as misguided or greedy, but as heretics worshippers of false idols. That degree of overcorrection suggests fear, not of swords or treasure, but of an idea too old to erase cleanly. An idea that might rewrite the Church's own origin story. Because if Horus was more than a god, if he was a prince whose descendants scattered through Africa into Nubia into Europe, then the boundary between myth and memory begins to blur. And with it, so does the foundation of what came after. Nowhere is that more haunting than in the concept of the Watcher. Across continents, across languages, this figure appears again and again, not as a conqueror, but a custodian. A boy who survives, who waits, who is neither wholly mortal nor divine, but something suspended in between. Could this be a mythological archetype? Certainly. But there's a reason the Templars sought him not in myth, but in maps. Their journey wasn't toward allegory, it was toward geography, genealogy, history. And here we must confront the final possibility that they found something. Not conclusive, not absolute, but enough to believe, enough to hide, and perhaps enough to hand off. Because if even a few among them thought the bloodline still lived, then their actions make a kind of tragic sense. Their silence, their final rites, their cryptic carvings in remote churches. They were trying to leave a trail, not to hoard the truth, but to protect it. Or at the very least, to keep it from being destroyed. Of course, there's no DNA test for Horus, no carbon-dated confirmation of a divine child's descendants. We are left instead with patterns, with whispers in stone, with questions that refuse to die. But isn't that always the way with forbidden history? The moment you get too close, it covers itself in sand again. Not gone, just waiting. So perhaps the real question isn't whether the bloodline existed. Perhaps it's why, after all this time, the Eye of Horus still watches. So now you rest. You've wandered through catacombs and citadels, through scorched maps and half-burned manuscripts, listening for a thread of truth hidden in chants in chapel walls, in the wind over dunes where names have been forgotten for 1,000 years. You followed the falcon's shadow, watched its silhouette stretch across centuries, across continents, across the very boundary where history surrenders to myth. And here at the end, it doesn't roar, it doesn't resolve, it lingers. Not every journey ends with a revelation. Some end with an awareness, a presence, like waking in a quiet room and realizing someone else has been there all along. Because maybe it's not about proving whether the bloodline survived. Maybe it's about understanding why so many tried to erase it. Why popes and kings and scribes and soldiers, all men obsessed with order and inheritance, seemed more afraid of a desert child than of a heretic army. Why in every record the references grow vaguer, the symbols more hidden, as if the truth wasn't lost, but deliberately smudged. Still, some things resist erasure. A flicker of blue lotus carved into a forgotten tomb. A boy's falcon-shaped pendant buried in the foundation of a church. A pattern of stars that doesn't quite match the sky unless you know where to stand. And a seal, small, cracked, pressed into wax, long dried, depicting not a knight, not a saint, but a child. With wings behind him and eyes older than stone. You feel the quiet now. Let it wrap around you like a cloak woven from candle smoke and desert winds. You've touched a mystery too old for certainty, too vast for proof, but still it breathes soft, slow, steady. Because stories like this aren't meant to shout. They're meant to stay with you like sand in your boot, like a melody you can't quite place. You'll carry it now whether you mean to or not. The idea that something ancient has survived not in books, but in blood. Not in cathedrals, but in silence. Not extinct, just watching. So close your eyes. Let the stars shift above you, and know that somewhere out there in the dark, the eye remains open.